There are some lines of poetry or lyrics from a song that can live with us our entire lives. And there's a whole process of growing into different qualities of understanding of those lines, but they're lines that we cherish and live with and become part of us. For me, one of them is T.S. Eliot's line, "The awful daring of a moment's surrender, which an age of prudence can never retract." And it always seemed to me one of the most fit ways of looking at these events in life. We might not even know that anything is going on at the time, but we make one decision rather than another, yield to lust, yield to some inordinate scheme that winds up going awry, or simply just take the left road instead of the right one. And that kind of surrendering creates its own sort of series of subsequent events, which when we look back in time, we realize this was a crossroads. I want to compare that with another line that has haunted me my whole life, and that is from Wallace Stevens' poem, Sunday Morning, and it's simply, "Death is the mother of beauty," and tell a kind of story to relate the two. Death is the mother of beauty, the awful daring of a moment's surrender, which an age of prudence can never retract. Kind of strikingly, they were both written at the same time. Eliot's line in 1921, the poem The Wasteland would be published the next year in 1922. His poem Sunday Morning appears in, Wallace Stevens' poem Sunday Morning appears in Harmonium, and was published in 23, but it was already in manuscript in 1922. So really we're talking about lines of the year 1922, or exactly 100 years ago. Enough time to grow into them. Death is the mother of beauty. You think about the role of death in the life of artists, and as a poetic trope, it's a very powerful thing. Johann Wolfgang Goethe writes of, "Unless you have experienced this to die and so to grow, you're only a troubled guest on the dark earth." The poet Sappho writes of death, "The tongue shatters, my skin runs with delicate flame, I'm hearing things in sweat cascades, and I am one with ocean, air, stars, sky, and lacking little to death." And obviously that's a description for her of orgasm, and Goethe's poem is a poem about those big transformations in life where there's some death of the self and a rebirth out of its ruins. Yeats says, "Know that when all words are said and a man or woman is fighting mad, something drops from eyes long blind. He completes his partial mind, for an instant stands at ease, laughs out loud, his heart at peace." Even the wisest man or woman grows tense with some sort of violence before they can accomplish fate, know their work, or choose their mate. But what I think is striking about that is the beginning, where something drops from eyes long blind, and you have to ask what drops. And I always see that as some crossroads of significant transformation where we literally experience a death of part of what was inside of us, and open up a new territory for rebirth and regeneration. But I have always thought, in a sense, that there is no possibility of creation, either in the sense of making art or creating the beautiful, without some kind of relinquishing or death of the self. Another poet, Garcia Lorca, is writing about Spanish dancers and says you can always tell the ones who have a spirit of duende about them, a duende in a sense of realizing death and finitude even in their dancing, because their dance is elevated to this sort of concentrated expression of pure energy and pure being. But you only do that as a dancer if you claim the ultimate finitude of this moment, as if this moment of dance being is all there is and all there was and all there will be, and there's a death presence even in that. So poets take this figure of death and dying and do something with it. Now, I recently, because of work I've been doing on another site, I've been thinking a lot about Charles Manson and the Manson family and the cultural impact of those murders on our psyches, our souls, our hearts, and the art of our period. It's a big sort of mythical chunk of modernity to see a group of kids on a commune, and suddenly that devolves, just like in Euripides, the Bacchae, into people who are following a leader, and further into these orgiastic reveries and wine and abandon and drink and craziness, and they achieve in the forest some sort of nirvana of pure self-expression and melting of selfhood till the ego disappears, and they're merged with this great sort of sense of collective and subordinate to the leader, Dionysus, who's mad with a pipe and with wine and all those things. But it doesn't stop there. They go out and they wind up engaging on a path of slaughter. And just like the Manson kids are following this charismatic leader, and they go out to the wilderness and they imbibe their drink and their drugs and whatnot, and enter into sort of this death of the ego state, and wind up sort of replaying the narrative trajectory of the Bacchae in such a expressive way that it leads not just to effective drama on the stage, but to bloodshed and permanent extinction of what really were beautiful and purposeful lives. That kind of death energy you see rising up, a sort of thanatos rising, that is typical of anyone who is involved in a sort of cult, or subordinating their own lives to the life of a charismatic leader. It's a very common trajectory. But what I want to argue is that that sort of thanatic or death energy could have been transformed into something very beautiful, just as Euripides, Bacchae on stage. There is a moment where their orgiastic Dionysian rituals are just an expression of pure beauty and being, and there were alternative paths to turning them into a frenzy of murder and destruction. And the question that's been plaguing me and fascinating me is simply this. You see this trajectory in the Manson family that you see in many artists and many groups, where there is an increasing sense of urgency and of death energy in their work. And you can see it in, for instance, the work of the Doors, where it starts out with the amazing song, The End, which moves deep into these primal urgencies and insurgencies, and creates this sort of rhythm of destruction and maybe of rebirth. But Jim Morrison takes those thanatic energies that were so much in the air, and what I mean by so much in the air is specifically, you go to say the years 1970, 1971, and there is almost like the shadow play going back and forth between the Manson family and what Morrison is doing artistically. Morrison does his King Snake crawl, and a week later the Manson kids are there in front of the courthouse doing their crawl. The whole trajectory of the song, This Is the End, seems to me like the soundtrack of the whole family as they moved from this relative paradise of belonging to the land and belonging to each other, to those same kinds of ideals leading to an act of carnage and destructiveness. And you look at what the difference is between those two groups, how they harness death energies or thanatic energies. Jim Morrison continually pouring them back into his music, and Manson pouring it into a path of human destructiveness. But there is the awful daring of a moment's surrender that an age of prudence can never retract moment for me. And I think that is when he produces a song, I Am a Mechanical Man, which is what I've been looking at recently. I'm thinking that song, which I think he wrote in 1969, and we have a production of him singing it in a 1971 film, anticipates in so many ways sort of electronic music that would come into favor 5, 6, 7 years hence. It's similar to what Lou Reed would do in his machine music stage. It's a magnificent and powerful song, and it's coming way before its time, and it's expressive of some sort of area of genius in the psyche of that sometimes demonic man. So you're raised with this question: someone who is known for infamy and known for horrible acts has at least something in his self that can produce an act of great beauty, a work of artistic importance, and a work original enough that it's expressive of musical strains that would not come to fruition in other artists for 5 or 6 or even a decade in the future. So there's this act of genius there. And what I think is this: I think that what fuels that song is a kind of death energy, a thenotic urgency that wants to insist on all the pressures that want to grind us down into unbeing and create a kind of insurgency against it, fueled with an awareness of the finitude and limitations of our being. And it's the same kind of stuff that would fuel a song like Jim Morrison's The End, or you're left with a choice. You are left with a choice. You're getting very close to those dark, mythic, Orestian, Dionysian energies that can go towards an act of creation and celebration. And if you claim that death is the mother of beauty and internalize that and cry and turn that into some sort of regeneration and some death of part of us and recreation of other parts, there's a possibility of turning it into art and beauty. And if instead you become thrall or slave to those dark insurgencies and those upsurging, unconscious, mythic rhythms of death that were driving the followers of Dionysus on the Athenian stage or in mythology, or that psychologists would call the beyond the pleasure principle death energies or thenotic energies. And if you yield to those and let them drive you, the musics of our being turns instead towards a music that moves towards mayhem instead of the music of expression and the music of life. Anyways, just a thought. Death is the mother of beauty, the awful daring of a moment's surrender, which an age of prudence can never retract. Charles Manson, before the murders, before he had done anything truly evil, making a song like I Am a Mechanical Man that seems to me a work of real artistic importance, could have been a crossroads. Feed the art, use the darkness to deepen the art, to deepen even human sympathy, to move into those regions of psyche and soul that are chthonic, underground, or of Hades, rather than some